Imagine being so feared by your enemy that they put a price on your head. 10,000 rubles for the man who could bring you down. Imagine being so effective in combat that when your opponents saw your aircraft, they would turn around and fly back to base rather than face you. Imagine shooting down 352 enemy aircraft over the course of 1,400 combat missions while never being shot down yourself. Not once. Not by enemy fire. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Erich Hartmann, the man Soviet pilots called the Black Devil, and the deceptively simple secret that made him the deadliest fighter pilot in the history of aerial warfare. What he discovered wasn't taught in any flight school. It wasn't about being the best marksman or the most skilled aerobatic pilot. It was something far more fundamental, something that would revolutionize how we understand air combat. And by the time you finish this story, you'll understand why his record of 352 confirmed victories will likely never be broken, and why the tactical philosophy he developed changed military aviation forever. Stay with me, because the secret of the Black Devil is about to be revealed. Before I tell you the exact technique Hartmann used to dominate the skies, you need to understand who this man was and how he became the most successful fighter pilot in history. Erich Alfred Hartmann was born on April 19, 1922 in Weissach, Germany. His father was a doctor, and like most parents, he hoped his son would follow in his footsteps into medicine. But Erich's mother had other ideas. She was one of the first female glider pilots in Germany, and she passed her love of aviation directly to her son. When Erich was just a child, his mother would take him up in gliders, and he fell in love with the sensation of flight, the freedom of soaring through the air, the way the world looked from above. This early exposure to aviation would shape the entire course of his life. The Hartmann family moved to China when Erich was 3 years old, trying to escape the economic devastation that had ravaged Germany after World War I. But the Chinese Civil War forced them to return in 1928, and Erich grew up in a Germany that was rebuilding itself, preparing for what would become the Second World War. As a teenager, Hartmann continued flying gliders, developing an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics, air currents, and the behavior of aircraft that would serve him later in combat. He learned to read the sky, to feel the subtle changes in wind and pressure, to understand how an aircraft responded to control inputs. This wasn't textbook knowledge. This was muscle memory, instinct, the kind of understanding that comes from thousands of hours of actual flying time. In October 1940, at age 18, Hartmann joined the Luftwaffe and began his flight training. He was a natural pilot, but he was also rebellious and cocky, traits that almost ended his career before it began. During one training exercise, he performed unauthorized aerobatic maneuvers low over an airfield, showing off his skills in a display of youthful arrogance. He was grounded for a week, confined to quarters, and had his pay docked. His instructors told him something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. Fly with your head, not with your muscles. It was a lesson about discipline, about thinking tactically, rather than just reacting with physical skill. Years later, Hartmann would say that this punishment, this forced period of reflection, probably saved his life because it taught him that survival in combat required more than just flying ability. By October 1942, Hartmann had completed his training and was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, or JG-52, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe. This unit was stationed on the Eastern Front, fighting against the Soviet Air Force in some of the most intense aerial combat of the war. And this is where Hartmann's story really begins, because his first combat mission was a complete disaster that nearly got him killed and almost got him kicked out of the Luftwaffe entirely. He was flying as a wingman to an experienced pilot named Edmund Rossmann, and when they spotted a group of Soviet fighters, Hartmann's eagerness and inexperience took over. He broke formation without orders, dove after an enemy aircraft, fired wildly without hitting anything, nearly collided with the Soviet fighter, panicked, ran for cover in low clouds, and then ran out of fuel and crash-landed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 in a field. He could have been killed. He should have been disciplined severely. Instead, his commander saw potential in the young pilot and gave him another chance. But this disaster taught Hartmann something crucial. He realized that aerial combat wasn't about bravery or aggression or showing off your flying skills. It was about survival. It was about making smart decisions. It was about patience and discipline and choosing the right moment to strike. This realization would lead him to develop the tactical approach that would make him the most successful fighter pilot in history. And the teacher who would show him the way was Edmund Rossmann, the same pilot whose wingman position Hartmann had abandoned on that first disastrous mission. Rossmann had an old arm injury that prevented him from engaging in the kind of aggressive dogfighting that most pilots favored. He couldn't twist and turn and bank sharply for extended periods because his injured arm simply couldn't handle the physical strain of high-G maneuvers. So Rossmann had developed a completely different approach to aerial combat. He would position himself above the battlefield, observe the enemy formations, evaluate the situation carefully, and only attack when he had identified a target that wasn't taking evasive action. Then he would dive, close to extremely short range, fire a brief burst, and immediately break away. He never got into prolonged engagements. He never tried to outmaneuver enemy fighters in turning battles. He attacked from advantage, struck with precision, and disappeared before the enemy could react. Hartmann watched Rossmann carefully and began to understand that this approach, born out of physical limitation, was actually tactically superior to the aggressive dogfighting that most pilots engaged in. Rossmann's method had several enormous advantages. First, by attacking from above, he always had the energy advantage because altitude could be converted into speed. Second, by only attacking targets that weren't maneuvering defensively, he dramatically increased his probability of success. Third, by firing at extremely close range, he eliminated most sources of error and ensured that his shots would be devastating. And fourth, by breaking away immediately after each attack, he never gave the enemy a chance to counterattack. Hartmann absorbed these lessons and began to develop his own variation of Rossmann's tactics. But Hartmann had one advantage that Rossmann didn't have. He wasn't limited by an arm injury. He could fly aggressively when necessary. So Hartmann combined Rossmann's patient, methodical approach with his own excellent flying skills and exceptional eyesight. He developed what would become his signature tactic, a four-step process that he called See, Decide, Attack, Reverse. Or, as he sometimes called it, the coffee break method. Let me break down exactly what this meant and why it was so devastatingly effective. See meant using his exceptional eyesight to spot enemy aircraft before they spotted him. Hartmann had naturally excellent vision, and he trained himself to constantly scan the sky, looking for the tiny dots or glints of reflected sunlight that might indicate enemy fighters. In aerial combat, the side that sees the enemy first has an enormous advantage. If you can see them and they can't see you, you control the engagement. You decide when and where to attack. They're reacting, you're acting. Hartmann understood that most pilots who got shot down never saw their attacker. They died without even knowing they were being hunted. So the first step was always to see the enemy before they saw you. Decide meant evaluating the tactical situation and determining whether to attack or to take a coffee break and wait for a better opportunity. This was the revolutionary part of Hartmann's method. Most fighter pilots of his era believed that if you saw enemy aircraft, you attacked immediately. Aggression was considered essential. Caution was seen as cowardice. But Hartmann understood that this approach got pilots killed. He would observe enemy formations carefully, looking for specific conditions. Was the enemy aware of his presence? Were they in a defensive formation watching for threats? Were they engaged in combat with other German fighters? Were they flying straight and level, or were they maneuvering? Hartmann would only attack if the conditions were favorable, if the enemy was alert and in a defensive posture, if the numbers were against him. If the tactical situation didn't favor an attack, he would simply wait. He would circle higher, maintain his altitude advantage, and look for a better opportunity. His fellow pilots sometimes thought he was being overly cautious, but Hartmann understood something they didn't. Every attack carried risk. A smart pilot minimized risk by only attacking when conditions were optimal. Attack meant closing to point-blank range before firing, and this is where Hartmann's technique became truly extraordinary. While most fighter pilots opened fire at ranges of 100 to 200 meters, trying to score hits with long-distance shooting, Hartmann would hold his fire until he was 20 meters or less from his target. 20 meters is 66 feet. That's closer than the length of a small house. At this range, the enemy aircraft would completely fill his windscreen. He couldn't miss. He would wait until the last possible second, until his brain was screaming at him to fire, until it seemed certain he was going to collide with the enemy aircraft, and only then would he unleash a short burst from his guns. Usually just a 2 or 3 second burst. At this range, the bullets from his 20mm cannon and machine guns would tear into the enemy aircraft with devastating effect, shredding control surfaces, puncturing fuel tanks, killing the pilot. The target would explode or spin out of control, and Hartmann would already be executing the next step. Reverse meant breaking away immediately after the attack, using a specific maneuver to disengage and re-evaluate the situation. Hartmann never stuck around to watch his victim fall. He never tried to confirm his kill visually. As soon as he fired, he would execute what pilots call a split S, rolling inverted and pulling back on the stick to dive away at maximum speed. This maneuver accomplished several things. It used gravity to help him accelerate away from the combat area. It made him a difficult target for any other enemy fighters that might try to avenge their comrade. And it positioned him to climb back to altitude and look for his next opportunity. The entire sequence from attack to reversal took only a few seconds, and then Hartmann would be gone, vanishing into the sky before the enemy formation could react. This technique, see, decide, attack, reverse, was deceptively simple, but it required iron discipline to execute properly. It required patience to wait for the perfect shot when every instinct screamed at you to fire. It required confidence to close to what seemed like suicidally short range. It required the judgment to know when to attack and when to take a coffee break. And it required the flying skill to execute violent maneuvers at high speed without losing control or blacking out from G-forces. Hartmann had all of these qualities, and he perfected his technique through constant practice and refinement. His first confirmed victories came in November and December of 1942, when he shot down 2 Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft using his new technique. These were slow, heavily armored aircraft that were relatively easy targets, but Hartmann still approached them with his methodical 4-step process. He observed them from above, verified they weren't taking evasive action, dove to attack from their blind spot, closed to point-blank range, fired a short burst, and reversed away. Both aircraft went down. Hartmann had proven his method worked. But his real education came in early 1943, when he was assigned a new mentor, Captain Walter Krupinski. Krupinski was an experienced fighter ace who had already scored dozens of victories, and he immediately recognized Hartmann's potential. Krupinski gave Hartmann the nickname Bubi, which means young boy or kid in German, because of his youthful appearance and innocent face. Despite the nickname, Krupinski took Hartmann seriously and began pushing him to refine his technique. During missions, Krupinski would constantly radio instructions. "Hey, Bubi, get in closer, get closer, don't fire yet, closer, now fire." Under Krupinski's guidance, Hartmann's confidence grew. He learned to trust his technique even when it seemed impossibly dangerous. He learned to hold his fire even when his target was in his sights and every fiber of his being wanted to pull the trigger. He learned to close to ranges that seemed suicidal, but were actually the key to his success. From May to August of 1943, while Krupinski was away recovering from wounds, Hartmann's victory total jumped from 17 to 60. He was no longer a promising rookie. He was becoming an ace, and the Soviet pilots were starting to notice. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history, and it was also one of the most intense periods of aerial combat on the Eastern Front. Thousands of aircraft from both sides fought for control of the skies above the massive tank formations below. Hartmann flew multiple missions every day during this battle, and his victory total climbed rapidly. On July 7th, he became an ace in a day for the first time, shooting down 7 Soviet aircraft in a single day using his trademark technique. Each time he followed the same process: see the enemy, decide whether conditions favored an attack. If yes, close to point-blank range. Fire a short burst, reverse away immediately. It worked every single time. By September 20th, 1943, Hartmann had shot down his 100th enemy aircraft. He was 21 years old. The Soviet command was well aware of his growing reputation, and they began to take specific measures against him. Soviet pilots learned to recognize his radio call sign, Karaya 1, and when they heard it on their radios, many would break off combat and return to base rather than risk facing him. The Soviet command put a bounty of 10,000 rubles on Hartmann's head, an enormous sum of money at the time, offering it to any pilot who could shoot him down. Hartmann decided to paint a distinctive marking on his aircraft, a black tulip design around the engine, cowling and spinner. It looked striking and aggressive, and Hartmann thought it would help his squadron mates identify his aircraft in combat. But it had an unintended consequence. Soviet pilots learned to recognize the black tulip, and when they saw it, they would refuse to engage. Entire formations would turn away rather than fight the aircraft with the black tulip marking. At first, Hartmann was frustrated because his kill rate dropped. Enemies kept running away from him, but then he realized he could use this to his advantage. He had other pilots in his squadron fly the aircraft with the black tulip marking, and those pilots found that enemy formations would avoid them, allowing them to fly in relative safety. Meanwhile, Hartmann switched to a standard paint scheme that made his aircraft look like every other Bf-109 in the squadron, and he continued racking up victories against enemies who had no idea they were facing the Black Devil until it was too late. The nickname Black Devil, or Cherny Chort in Russian, became Hartmann's most famous moniker. Soviet pilots spoke of him with a mixture of respect and terror. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, appearing out of the sun to make a single devastating attack and then vanishing before anyone could react. Soviet intelligence reports described him as a pilot of extraordinary skill and ruthless efficiency. Soviet propaganda portrayed him as a demon, an inhuman killer who showed no mercy. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Hartmann wasn't ruthless or merciless. He was methodical. He was disciplined. He was patient. He simply executed his 4-step technique with mechanical precision over and over, mission after mission, until shooting down enemy aircraft became almost routine. But there was nothing routine about the risks Hartmann took. His technique of closing to point-blank range meant he was constantly in danger of collision or of being hit by debris from the aircraft he had just destroyed. On May 25, 1943, Hartmann actually collided with a Soviet fighter instead of shooting it down. His aircraft was badly damaged, and he had to crash land in Soviet-held territory. He was captured by Soviet infantry, but he managed to escape by faking severe injuries, pretending to be unconscious while his captors loaded him onto a truck, and then jumping out when they were distracted and running through fields of tall sunflowers until he reached German lines. It was an incredibly dangerous situation, and many pilots would have decided to be more cautious after such a close call. But Hartmann simply refined his technique to avoid future collisions and continued using his point-blank attack method. Throughout 1944, Hartmann's victory total continued to climb at an astonishing rate. He shot down his 200th enemy aircraft on March 2, 1944. He reached 250 victories in June. On August 17th, he surpassed Gerhard Bachhorn to become the highest-scoring fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe. On August 24th, after shooting down 11 Soviet aircraft in 2 missions, he passed 300 victories, becoming the only pilot in history to reach this milestone. The German High Command was monitoring his claims carefully because the numbers seemed almost impossible to believe. They assigned observers to fly in his formation specifically to verify his victories. They double-checked and triple-checked every claim. Every single one was confirmed. In May 1944, Hartmann faced American aircraft for the first time when P-51 Mustangs appeared over the Eastern Front. The Mustang was arguably the best piston-engine fighter aircraft of the war, faster and more maneuverable than the Bf-109 that Hartmann flew. But Hartmann's tactical approach worked just as well against American pilots as it had against Soviet pilots. On May 21st, he shot down 2 P-51s. On June 1st, he shot down 4 more. He used exactly the same technique: see them first, decide whether to attack, close to point-blank range, fire a short burst, reverse away. The Americans never knew what hit them. Hartmann later admitted that he had greater respect for American pilots than for Soviet pilots, not because Americans were inherently better, but because American aircraft were technologically superior and American pilots received more extensive training. Soviet pilots, especially in the early years of the war, often flew in rigid formations, didn't take evasive action, and had poor defensive tactics. When British test pilot Captain Eric Brown asked Hartmann after the war how he had achieved such an incredible number of victories, Hartmann explained that Soviet Sturmovik ground attack aircraft flew in formations like American B-17 bombers, making no evasive maneuvers with only a single rear-facing machine gun for defense. Hartmann said he wouldn't open fire until the aircraft filled his entire windscreen, and at that range, he couldn't miss. He got one every time. But Hartmann's technique wasn't just about shooting down easy targets. He used the same approach against experienced Soviet fighter pilots, against heavily armed and armored aircraft, against overwhelming numerical odds. The technique worked because it was based on sound tactical principles. By attacking from advantage, by only engaging when conditions were favorable, by closing to a range where accuracy was guaranteed, and by disengaging immediately to avoid counterattack, Hartmann minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. It was a formula for success that didn't depend on having the best aircraft or being the most skilled aerobatic pilot. It depended on discipline, patience, judgment, and precise execution. Hartmann's final victory came on May 8, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender. He shot down a Soviet Yakovlev Yak-9 fighter that was performing aerobatics over Soviet troops who were celebrating what they thought was the end of the war. It was Hartmann's 352nd confirmed victory, a record that has never been approached by any other pilot in any conflict. When the war ended, Hartmann surrendered to American forces, hoping to be held as a prisoner of war by the Western Allies. But under the terms of the Yalta agreements, German pilots who had fought on the Eastern Front had to be turned over to the Soviet Union. On May 24th, Hartmann and his unit were handed over to Soviet forces. What followed was 10 years of imprisonment that tested Hartmann's resilience even more than 3 years of combat had. The Soviets wanted to pressure him into joining the East German military that they were creating, When he refused, they tried him on fabricated war crimes charges, claiming he had deliberately shot down Soviet civilian aircraft and had been responsible for civilian deaths. None of these charges were true. Hartmann had never attacked civilian targets. His 352 victories were all against military aircraft engaged in combat operations. But the Soviet military tribunal convicted him anyway and sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor, later increased to 25 years. Hartmann spent a decade in various Soviet prison camps and gulags, including camps in Siberia, where temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero. He endured brutal conditions, inadequate food, constant interrogations, and attempts to break his spirit. The Soviets tried to force him to confess to war crimes he hadn't committed. They threatened his family. They held him in solitary confinement for months at a time, in tiny cells where he could barely move. They tried to make him inform on his fellow prisoners. Hartmann refused every attempt to break him. He maintained his innocence. He filed formal complaints. He demanded international inspections that never came. He survived on the same mental discipline and focus that had kept him alive in combat. During his imprisonment, Hartmann's first son, Erich Peter, was born in 1945 and died in 1948 at age 3, without Hartmann ever having seen him. This knowledge, that his son had lived and died while he was imprisoned, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his captivity. When other prisoners began organizing a revolt in one camp, protesting the brutal conditions, Hartmann was singled out by the guards as a ringleader and severely punished, though he had actually tried to prevent the revolt because he knew it would end badly for everyone involved. In 1955, after Stalin's death and during a period of warming relations between the Soviet Union and West Germany, Hartmann was finally released, along with the last group of German prisoners of war. He returned to West Germany, reunited with his wife Ursula, and tried to rebuild his life. In 1956, he joined the newly formed West German Luftwaffe and became the first commander of Jagdgeschwader 71, a fighter wing named after the famous World War I ace Manfred von Richthofen. He flew jet aircraft and trained a new generation of German pilots, passing on the tactical lessons he had learned. But Hartmann's post-war military career ended in controversy. The West German Luftwaffe was being equipped with the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, an advanced jet that Hartmann believed was too dangerous and poorly suited to the missions German pilots would be expected to fly. He was proven tragically correct when 282 F-104 aircraft crashed in non-combat accidents, killing 115 German pilots. But Hartmann's outspoken criticism of the aircraft and the procurement process made him unpopular with his superiors, and he was forced into early retirement in 1970. After leaving the military, Hartmann worked as a civilian flight instructor, teaching the next generation of pilots the fundamentals of safe and effective flying. He occasionally gave interviews about his wartime experiences, though he generally preferred not to dwell on the past. He flew in an aerobatics team with Adolf Galland, another famous German ace from World War II. He lived a quiet life, largely out of the public eye, until his death from natural causes on September 20th, 1993, at age 71. In 1997, 4 years after Hartmann's death, the Russian government formally reviewed his case and posthumously cleared him of all charges, acknowledging that he had been wrongly convicted. The Russian military prosecutors stated officially that Hartmann had not committed any war crimes, and that his conviction had been a malicious prosecution motivated by political considerations rather than justice. Today, Hartmann's tactical techniques are studied in military academies around the world. His see-decide attack reverse method, also called the ODA loop in modern military terminology, has been adapted and expanded upon by generations of fighter pilots. The principles he discovered, seeing the enemy first, Evaluating before engaging, attacking from advantage, and disengaging to reassess form the foundation of modern air combat doctrine. Fighter pilots in every advanced air force learn variations of Hartmann's technique because it works. It worked in 1943, and it still works today. The secret of the Black Devil wasn't about being fearless or aggressive. It was about being smart. It was about patience and discipline. It was about understanding that the pilot who survives is the pilot who thinks clearly under pressure, who chooses when to fight and when to wait, who closes to a range where victory is certain, and who lives to fight another day. Hartmann flew 1,404 combat missions and engaged in aerial combat on 825 separate occasions. He was forced to crash land 16 times due to mechanical failures or damage from debris, but he was never shot down by enemy fire. Not once in 3 years of combat. That's not luck. That's the result of a tactical approach so sound, so well thought out, so perfectly executed, that it kept him alive through thousands of engagements while making him the deadliest aerial warrior in history. The record of 352 confirmed victories will almost certainly never be broken. Modern air warfare is different. Aircraft are faster, engagements happen at longer ranges, missiles replace guns. Fighter pilots today might fly entire careers without ever seeing enemy aircraft, much less engaging in the kind of close-range aerial combat that Hartmann specialized in. His record stands as a monument to a specific type of warfare that existed only briefly in human history, when men flew piston-engine fighters and fought each other with cannons and machine guns at ranges measured in meters rather than kilometers. But the lessons Hartmann taught us transcend the specific circumstances of World War II aerial combat. His story teaches us that success in any competitive endeavor comes from thinking clearly, planning carefully, choosing your battles wisely, and executing with precision. It teaches us that discipline beats aggression, that patience beats recklessness, that thinking beats reacting. It teaches us that the way to become the best isn't necessarily to be the bravest or the most talented, but to be the smartest about how you use whatever talents you have. Erich Hartmann, the Black Devil, the Blonde Knight, the most successful fighter pilot in history, proved that superiority in combat comes from superior thinking. His 352 victories weren't about flying skill, though he was an excellent pilot. They weren't about courage, though he had plenty. They were about having a better tactical approach than anyone else, refining it through constant practice, and executing it with unwavering discipline. That was his secret. That was what made him unstoppable, and that's why his story still matters today. Now I want to hear from you. Did you know about Erich Hartmann before watching this video? What surprised you most about his tactical approach? Understanding how the greatest fighter pilot in history thought and operated gives us lessons that go far beyond military aviation. If you found this story as compelling as I did, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss our next incredible World War II story. And please watch this video all the way through and leave a comment below. We need to hit 100 comments to continue bringing you more inspiring stories like this one. Tell me what aspect of Hartmann's technique you found most fascinating, and if you want, tell me from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video appearing on your screen right now.